Hello, everyone, and welcome to At Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer, and welcome to our guest, Jonathan Bush, founder and CEO of Zus Health. Jonathan, great to see you.
Same here, Andy. It's a treat.
Zeus means what? King of the Greek gods. And then also, what problem is Zus Healthcare trying to solve?
Zeus is in fact, even though we misspelled it in order to own the brand, assuming we ever become famous and have a brand to protect, is in fact Athena's father, among other important jobs he played as a head god and a font of a lot of the story. And in fact, Zus Health endeavors to be the font of a lot of the story by being a common medical record, just the record, not the software that ladies at the office or the doctors in the exam room use, but just the actual version of truth that lies beneath. Just as you can walk up to any bank machine and see your balance and all the data that sits in one place, regardless of what front end you're at, Zus endeavors to be a single, always on, logically joined, because they all these different places make data and manifest it in different ways. One logically joined version of truth that doctors and patients can use.
All right, so both for doctors and patients.
Yeah, start with doctors and we'll get to patients. My dream is the patients, but
right.
The laws are such that the doctors, I am allowed to compel every hospital and doctor's office to give me data if it's a doctor I'm serving.
But you run squarely into HIPAA with this.
I use HIPAA as my truncheon, because HIPAA and another law that we worked on called the Cures Act back in 2016 makes it illegal to block the sharing of electronic data with another doctor who's treating a patient. So
right.
If you got all that money to buy your EMR from the government and you have data on a patient and another doctor is treating that patient, you must respond to their query with whatever data you have.
Well, it seems
and that makes room for a great business, right? Hey, everybody's got to respond, so I can actually build one single version of truth for everybody. And then you got to make it financially attractive to use that thing, but
right.
At least I can build it now.
I mean, it seems compelling because when I walk in a doctor's office, they give me a clipboard.
You bet.
With a piece of paper.
2024,
and do you have a pen?
There's the clipboard.
I don't have a pen.
I don't even carry a pen anymore.
They don't have pens either.
How about the CD for your imaging?
Right.
Like, find me a machine in this building
right.
that's still got the slot for the CD to go in.
So who is against this? Like, what barriers?
Whose
what
ox is gored?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the academic medical centers had in mind the idea that their data, just as many of the inventions, would become sort of licensable, powerful extra resources that would, of course, fund the treatment of the poor or whatever else their self-assessment includes. So they aren't thrilled at the idea that somebody else might take their data and make it into a bigger data pile that is more useful. They would rather anybody who wants their data come with a checkbook and a requests that they can evaluate and et cetera. So that's probably and the software companies that serve them, of course, would like to say that, hey, you got to come to our software company and to our customers. So anybody who had that in mind, obviously, would rather this not happen.
What's the business model? I mean, who would pay for this then?
It's a good question. Obviously someday, the business model is to not be the guy, to not have the full picture of a patient. I mean, you can imagine a world when people are used to the idea that a doctor knows their full story, and a guy says, well, I wanted to save $2, so I have no idea about your lab results. Like, what? Right? But today, since nobody has any idea, like, who's going to be the first penguin, and why are they jumping into the ocean when all the other penguins are happily on the iceberg? So what we've had to do is find doctors who make money knowing the whole picture. And those are provider organizations that are at risk for the total cost of care. And so if you are, let's say you're a diabetes specialist, and you say, hey, if you bring your employees or your health plan members to our diabetes network, the total cost of those diabetics will go down. At that point, you really need to know where those people are going, what other care they're receiving, what other things are going on that may affect your ability to finish that episode of care. And there are now thousands of these companies. Even traditional medical groups are using what they call accountable care contracts, where they'll say, hey, I'll do my care, but also we'll track these patients and give me half the savings if I bring the cost down.
Right.
And so more and more and more lives, Medicare members who are part of Medicare Advantage, and that's now the majority, just recently went to the majority, are being cared for by medical groups that make money if they get those Medicare unnecessary hospitalizations, duplicate drugs. We all hear the horror stories. Everyone we know is somebody got the wrong drug or ended up in the hospital overnight because some form was missing. So those guys are happy to pay a couple of dollars a month to know the full truth about their patients wherever they go.
So what about privacy? Who owns the data? In other words, what if I wanted to block the fact that I saw a shrink 20 years ago or something
Yes.
like that?
So consumers, there is a blocking provision in HIPAA. It's very rarely used. It's honestly like the only times I've seen it are professional athletes at an orthopedic group where they say, hey, look, don't send the bill to my insurance company, and block it. And then, it'll say blocked and you will see that there was an encounter.
They don't want people to know about an injury, something like that. Yeah, right.
So it does happen, and we've made sort of, just like Frank Perdue, we do more than we're required by the government to protect our chickens. And I like that. I like that, we'll build the ability for somebody to shut themselves off, as well as the ability, which is much more sought after, to actually have a doctor know the whole picture.
Right. You've been working in the healthcare industry for a long time, Jonathan. Yes. Question I want you to answer in under 1 minute. What's wrong with the U.S. healthcare system?
1 minute?
Yeah, how about 30 seconds?
Here you go.
Okay.
No demand curve.
What does that mean?
When a hospital lowers its price, they don't get new market share. When they raise their price, they don't lose market share. Everywhere else in this town, all these beautiful magazine empires, right, got squeezed to death by that demand curve. A little bit more subscribership here, a little less, ads going through the Google instead, and it just squeezes them and squeezes them and squeezes them. That squeezing is almost impossible to create in healthcare because of the brokenness of the demand curve. There are counterfactuals, there are regulations. Even a health plan who assembles all the costs of all the inputs to coverage and gives you a premium. You'd think, hey, a lower premium, would get you market share. But even those health plans, if you actually save money as a health plan, there is a risk adjustment factor where the government comes and says, you saved so much money, we think your patients are less sick. You give money over to your competitor. You give your profits to your competitor. What? So now it can be done. The demand curve can be found. But my 30 years of this is really essentially about finding little nuggets, little corners where you can make the natural demand curve work. And once you get the demand curve, you get efficiencies, you get inventions, you get passion, you get excitement, you get optimism.
But that sounds like bringing a lot of capitalism to healthcare when some people say it should be a single-payer system.
Yes, those people and I should be having this conversation so that we can work it out.
You don't believe in a single-payer system?
No. If anything, I believe the government should be working to make sure there are more players in each game. I'm almost a antitrust person in healthcare. We've got a lot of monopoly power, some of which was inadvertently created by the government, and we need more players. Firefly Health, which is a company I'm on the board of, and my wife is the CEO. This is a company that, as a virtual first primary care group, assembled all of the other inputs in order to go and sell a health plan so that there could be a demand curve. And they are reducing the cost of care dramatically for their self-insured employers, and the employees love it. But they had to spend years building the ability to show up as a functional equivalent to, Cigna or whatever. What a lot of work.
But wait, wasn't Obamacare successful? And isn't that the government getting more into the business?
Obamacare was successful at wealth redistribution. And it's fun, they call it the Affordable Care Act. They didn't call it the Less Expensive Care Act. So Obamacare did nothing to make health care itself more affordable. They just put money, tax dollars into it to subsidize people based on their income. So as a wealth distribution mechanism, I'd say it's better than food stamps. It's a very successful, popular wealth redistribution mechanism, as is Medicare. And
so you don't like Medicare either?
Oh, I would have loved for us to not go down. I'll never forget the quote, Lyndon Johnson with his cowboy boots on his desk, like, what does it cost you? Just give them everything. Mm-hmm. And the guy's, well, right now it would only be, I forgot the number, like 2% of the federal government, but we don't know what would happen after that. And he said, well, how bad could it possibly be? Let's do that one. Mm-hmm. And then the genie got out of the bottle and, woohoo. it's whatever it is now, percentage of the entire economy because of the lack of management. Now we're seeing a little bit of pullback there thanks to Medicare Advantage, and I hope that continues.
What about Washington's role at all, though, here? I mean, do they have a role at all?
Look, what I love about this country is most of the time, Washington is conscientiously, non-cynically trying to help. Obamacare was a conscientious, non-cynical attempt at making sure that everybody could show up on a website somewhere and get something they could afford. What a lovely thing. The inadvertent crushing of the demand curve and therefore the dampening of innovation and the slowing of product development. They weren't thinking of, they didn't want, if you would ask them, hey, do you want to slow product development? They'd say, no, of course not, right? In fact, here's our government-sponsored innovation conference. Oh, good, a government innovation conference. Thank God we fixed that problem. So I think of all those things in Washington as a bunch of people getting together and mostly, as a group, wanting to bring something good home. And certainly Obamacare and Medicare and all these things are those things. But you got to remember, when you jam everybody's nose in the same puppy poop, a lot of unintended downstream consequences accumulate. And I think that's always the risk with jamming everybody into one idea.
Shifting gears, I want to ask you about your time at Athena and leaving Athena. You mentioned Athena, and that was a painful time for you. Elliott Management came in, activists. Stock price not moving. They said you weren't the right guy. There were questions raised about your behavior at work, an altercation with your wife. Some of those allegations were withdrawn. Some of them you acknowledged and apologized for. What did you take away from that time period, Jonathan?
I think the big Barrons audience takeaway is there is an unconscious underlying assumption that activist investors want the same thing as other investors, but only on steroids. And in the case of my experience, I thought that this activist investor wanted to steal a very good asset from other investors. But in my case, I was saying to the board, look, what companies grow 23% organically from $1 billion, right, and have 70% gross margins, but sell on saving people money? This was a really powerful asset. And I believed in running a lot of science projects along the side to see what would the next growth spurt come from. So I very publicly would say in investor conferences, at 40% corporate tax rate, I'd rather reinvest in R&D, right? So they come in and say, look, he runs these, whatever they said. But one thing led to another, and they created a company. I don't know if they created or we just happened to become a company in chaos during the exact period of their campaign. Maybe a really amazing coincidence. They bought this thing for like distress company pricing, a company that's growing and profiting. 3 years later, all these wonderful, 401k owners and unions and school, CalPERS are in the thing. They're exited at, $5.7 billion. 3 years later, these guys, having built no new products or anything else, flip it for $17 billion. That is money that those long holders should have had. Set aside me. I could have been fired. I could have been kept. I could have been moved over. But that's not what happened. What happened was the whole company was sold as a distress sale and flipped 3 years later for 3x.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Forget me. Forget Athena. Forget the poor shareholders who got fleeced, right? But be aware. Next time an activist shows up and says, we're all on the same side, I'm just doing it on steroids, be aware that may not be how it looks at the end.
And what's the situation with that now?
Some guy owns them for, lovely guys, bought it for $17 billion, and, they're trying to make 2024 money look like 2021 money. They've got to grow a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's a lovely company run by lovely guys. And it always was. Now it's a little lighter. They've sold the headquarters and, sold the wood out of the chairs or whatever activists do to make money. But
right. And what's going on with Zus? What sort of funding do you have?
Just great stuff. It's not evenly distributed, but the venture capital ecosystem in this country is really something.
In a good way.
Yeah. Yeah, in a good way. Obviously, new venture capitalists run into their first bad situation and get scared and maybe act scared. We all do. We're all guilty of that in various ways. But the idea of pooling, $35 million and then 2 years later another $35 million into this completely non-existent abstract notion and seeing an actual company emerge. I was running, I guess we had about 5,500 employees, $1.1 billion, something like that in revenue. And there I am with 20 engineers arguing about whether this or that will work and people will like it with no real evidence either way, and going, what the hell am I doing here? But here's this money and I don't want to disappoint these VCs and it really should exist. And then suddenly I blink and there's 60 customers and they're using it more and we're getting referred and the value is growing and other companies are asking maybe 1 + 1 is 3 and holy cow, there's a company there. And what a feeling.
You referred to some guy who said you might not be a public company CEO ever again for various reasons.
Yes.
But what's the story with Zus? Will it ever IPO? Would you be the CEO?
I hope guys like me get included in the potpourri of CEOs in the public space. I think it is good to have a wide range of approaches. And I think everybody filing off their edges to fit into a little linear graph, honestly, it creates corruption, it creates cynicism, and it creates fragile markets. So I hope that guy was wrong about guys like me. I loved getting Athena to, living at, I was there for 22 years, from literally a basement to, a public burning, in a big company headquarters. And what a great experience. I don't think I need to do it again because there are other mountains to climb. So I think I would be allowed. I think there's enough investors in the public markets that would let me, would have me, but I'd like to see another CEO run this and, find other things to do.
I want to ask you, Jonathan, how you got into healthcare. I mean, you're the nephew of George H.W. Bush, the cousin of George W. Bush, the political family. How come you didn't do politics? How come you got into healthcare?
Well, one of the things my dad said is, you should do politics, but not until you've signed both sides of a paycheck. Like, please don't be one of these intellectual Wesleyan graduates who goes and tells everybody how to live. Because I went to Wesleyan and he found that a little intellectual. And I've been living on that advice, ever since. Make sure you've signed both sides of the paycheck. Make sure you know how capital formation works. Make sure you know the evils of the market and the goodness of the market. And then maybe try to regulate other people's lives.
Right. You worked as an EMT, though, and you were a medic.
Yeah. So
in the Army?
The other thing he said is if you want to build a great business, really know the product.
Right.
If you want to work at Disney, be the mouse in the park. Get pee on your, costume while you pose for a photo with somebody in their lap,
Right.
And I felt like healthcare, getting inside that ambulance and being inside those shotgun homes in New Orleans in the middle of the night where, there's a lot of despairing, and then seeing the click, 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 even in this struggling, very poor healthcare system, non-wealthy healthcare system.
Right.
How we can just work miracles was a really, really wonderful first step for me.
I said, I mentioned quickly you were a medic in the military. Was that correct?
Yeah. So
Army?
then we had what was it? Desert Storm.
Yeah.
And I had been done this. I'd actually treated a fair number of gunshot wounds. In New Orleans. Sadly, that year, 1990, there was plenty of gunshot wounds every night, and so there was sort of TV commentary about George Bush sending the black man to shoot the brown man to get the white man his oil back or whatever, and I was appalled by that. I also had a big term paper due, and I also had this experience treating gunshot wounds, so I literally walked down to the Army recruiter and said, can you use EMTs? And the guy was like, yeah, and I'm behind on my number, So I took the test, and next thing you know, off I went. And of course, the Gulf War wasn't a forever war by any stretch. It was about 23 days. And so I never saw a shot fired, but had a great experience of how algorithm-based medicine works in the Army and learned a lot.
Does the family get together and talk about politics, particularly in this season?
Well, as the family has grown, and my cousins have had children and grandchildren, I don't get included in the political side's traffic very often because they've got a huge crowd. We did have a first cousin of mine who became a preacher in Virginia, came to preach at a baptism in Kennebunkport, and there was this reassembly of my generation at the cousin level, and all of our children, and who had often never met each other because we went off to North Haven Island, and the Kennebunkport crowd stayed with the presidential crowd, and there they all were, and it was a very sweet These are very loving, sweet people.
How many
It's
Bushes
funny,
was
you start
that?
to see your own cousin only through a public lens. You forget this wonderful, fully dimensional human that he is.
How many Bushes were there?
Oh, God. I think on the pickleball court cookout, I mean, had to be 80, swirling around.
That's great. That's great. And final question, Jonathan. Which candidate is better for healthcare in America, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? And what do you think about the possibility of RFK Jr. Having a role in the Trump administration in the healthcare sector?
Well, to me, Trump is not worth considering because of his emotional instability. I think it's too dangerous a thing. That being said, a guy who doesn't try to micromanage his agencies and let people whose whole life has been commerce or defense or healthcare is a good approach. And I did think that the incredibly good intentions of the Obama team were foiled by a lot of their micromanagement from the White House staff down into these agencies. So I like that sort of general management approach. But it's sort of not worth asking when you have a person who's, in my experience, sort of not stable.
Right, right. All right, well, it's great to visit with you again, Jonathan.
You
Jonathan
bet.
Bush, CEO of Zus Health. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a real treat. Thanks a lot for having me.
This is at Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll catch you next time.